Philosophy has historically been presented as an activity of contemplation. It's done from the comfort of an armchair or an ivory tower. All the philosopher needs is a mind which can reason, and he or she can philosophize till the ends of the earth. This is often accompanied by the assumption that thought precedes action. Thought commands and action obeys. We first imagine our actions and inventions in thought, and then we set out to bring them to life in reality. But modern psychology reveals to us that this sequence of events isn't quite right. We often begin an action unconsciously, and only later does our mind construct a narrative to explain to us why we're doing it. Thought more often plays the role of narrator rather than instigator. I've spoken about how this applies to the relationship between technology and science in other videos. We assume that our theories lead to new inventions, but in the majority of cases, it's the invention which concretely embodies an abstract law, which we then derive from the invention. The lever and the balance had long been in use before Aristotle derived their theoretical nature in the law of the lever. So we actually invent something, unconscious of its full inner workings, and then we study it and learn from it. Anyway, there's a cluster of theories which push back against the privileging of contemplation in knowledge. Embodied cognition, extended mind theory, and material engagement theory all argue that we think through our body and our actions rather than through our minds. If you remember from my first video, our mental space is modeled on the physical one. Material speculation, physical definition, and manipulation provide the case study for forms of mental speculation, conceptual definition, and manipulation of mental objects. The mental ability to grasp a concept or to wrap one's head around something emerges from the prior embodied experience of handling, grasping, and encircling things in the material world. New ways of thinking lead to new ways of doing. By transforming the physical world, we simultaneously construct our own mental architecture. This is the sense in which, long before the mind directed the hand, as it seems to do today, the hand educated the mind. This occurs at the level of society as well. Society's head is its thinkers, its intellectual class, and its body, or its hand, is its laborers. You have the building manager and the builder. One does the thinking, the other one does the building. You have the white-collar class and the blue-collar class, the head and body of society. But when did this division come into being? Because if you watch my first video, for Leroy-Gorin, intellect and technicity are from the very beginning deeply entangled. How is it that they've become so separate now? Well, we see some signs of a division between mental and manual labor in the Bronze Age. Writing and maths were invented to calculate debts and to extract wealth from the lower classes. But this was not yet a proper division of mental and manual labor, because the mental labor was simultaneously manual labor. The geometricians of this age were rope stretchers, and the mathematicians were users of the abacus. Mathematics and geometry were largely bound to their tools. Over time, however, mathematical thinking detached itself from its instruments. This reached its peak in ancient Greece. Why? Because in ancient Greece, a proper division between intellectual and manual labor appeared. For two reasons. First, slave labor allowed almost all male citizens to be completely free of manual labor. Second, Bronze Age economies were dependent on a centralized bureaucratic planning apparatus. This was the original purpose of intellectual activity, to calculate the distribution of resources. But the ancient Greeks had an unplanned economy. They had a market. Intellectual labor was no longer bound to administrative or technical work, and this allowed theory to emerge as distinct from manual practice. I'm now going to follow the argument of a few thinkers who say that the birth and death of ancient Greek philosophy is dependent on the relationship between intellectual and manual labor in ancient Greece. This is the argument of the classicist Benjamin Farrington, the pragmatist John Dewey, and the author of the book Vico and the Maker's Knowledge Tradition, Maurizio Esposito. In early ancient Greece, the division between the mercantile aristocracy and the slaves was not so antagonistic. The aristocracy recognized their dependence upon slavery and promoted the constant invention of new techniques. Accordingly, their philosophy reflected this. The intellectual complement of this state of affairs was the natural philosophy of the Ionians. Instead of the kind of projections we see in mythical thought of human agency, the Ionian natural philosophers projected labor processes onto nature. Atoms are the building blocks of life. Sickness is the body's elements out of proportion, like badly mixed materials. And harmony is like the tension of a bow. The Ionians sought to understand the inner workings of nature, but understood that they were best positioned to understand the inner workings of human craft. Perhaps human creative activity could illuminate the inner character of natural processes. So, the Ionians used the work of the artisan as a metaphor for nature. Their philosophy presented itself as a list of labor analogies. Through our practical efforts, the natural world, which would be in itself alien, meaningless, and incomprehensible to us, acquires meanings, scopes, and intelligibility. However, as the division between mental and manual labor deepened, and the aristocrats shook off the last dregs of manual labor, a new kind of philosopher was born. Pythagoras and Parmenides emphasized the complete independence of art and science, practice and speculation, human and non-human worlds, and artificial and natural entities. The aristocrats, now completely relieved of manual labor, saw their new purpose in intellectual labor. This somewhat clarifies why ancient Greek philosophy presents itself as a cosmic projection of money. Once the philosophers had been abstracted from practical life, the only tool or system that they still had intimate knowledge of was money. But the idea that knowledge came from the slaves, that the masters were somehow dependent upon the slaves for their ideas, was completely unacceptable for the philosophers. Plato sets out to tackle this problem. He tries to reverse the narrative of dependence. It is the flute player who informs the flute maker about which flutes respond well in actual playing, and prescribes how they should be made, while the maker obeys him. There are those who know and do not act, and those who act and do not know. What Plato is arguing is that the consumer knows the artifact better than the producer, and by extension that the philosopher, abstracted from practical life, knows the world better than the slave who's in the midst of it. This is the birth of the idea of knowledge at a distance. Of course, no one today would argue that a shoe wearer or a guitar player knows these instruments better than their maker. This is just Plato's unwillingness to accept his dependence upon slavery. It's a familiar kind of reversal. Those on top present themselves as independent, and those on bottom as dependent. But in actual fact, the king is more dependent upon his people than the people are dependent upon him. This position runs through Plato's entire philosophy. First, he tries to provide a notion of pure philosophy, which completely excludes any mention of practice or experiment. Second, he sets up a body-soul distinction in which the soul is master of the body, which is the slave. Thirdly, both him and Aristotle attempt to expel all labor analogies from their philosophy, which they find to be impossible. If you read them, they're littered with labor analogies. Fourth, Plato argues that true philosophy must abstract itself from human affairs, and that a true philosopher must be independent of material necessity. In other words, a slave cannot be a philosopher. Fifth, for Plato, art distorts truth rather than reflects it. Sixth, Plato's conception of the demiurge mirrors quite closely his notion of the philosopher king, who dictates creation from above. However, in a momentary lapse, he describes the demiurge as forming matter in the same way a carpenter shapes wood. Aristotle moves to correct him. For Aristotle, the demiurge brings existence into being by mere contemplation. He attempts to appropriate creation, which is the central capacity of the artisan, for the thinker. Unfortunately, what is unconsciously informing many of Plato's philosophical decisions is his dislike of the slaves, his inability to accept his dependence upon them. So, the ethic of Ionian philosophy was characterized by a recognition of manual labor. The ethic of later philosophy was unfortunately elitism. Its aim was to purify thought of all mentions of practice. Abstraction and social status were directly proportional. Think about it. What does hierarchy do? It abstracts the elite from the masses. It lifts the king into a world of his own, up and outside. Mental abstraction is the mirror of the social abstraction of mental and manual labor. As a result of the division of mental and manual labor, Aristotle produced the first hierarchy of the sciences. Anything which pure thought achieved had been calculated beforehand and was therefore a matter of necessity. Anything which practice achieved was therefore a matter of chance. This referred to the human world of politics, ethics, economics, and labor, which all at the time were learnt by practice. There could therefore be no universal laws governing this world. Human affairs were a matter of contingency and novelty. The natural world, however, was subject to universal laws of reason and could therefore be contemplated scientifically. Prior to this turn in ancient Greece, it had been the natural world which was considered inherently chaotic, and the human world which was rules-based. With this came the hierarchy of the sciences which exists to this day, where the natural sciences are privileged over the human sciences. This is something I will challenge in a future video. Eventually, the sharp division between head and hand suffocated the continuance of ancient Greek philosophy. Science was born again in Italy during the Renaissance, when thinkers revisited the crafts and took inspiration from them. The most famous of these was Leonardo da Vinci, and much later, the father of modern science, Galileo Galilei, who provided one of the earliest formulations of the machine theory of science, the idea that technology may provide inspiration for science. But what set these people apart is that they were both artisans, inventors, and thinkers. It was Francis Bacon who systematized this approach to science. In fact, some people even argue that the scientific method is merely the philosophical distillate of the approach of Renaissance artisans. The triumph of modern science is the unification of theory and experiment, thought and practice, head and hand. It is only by recreating parts of nature in labs that we understand it from within. In summary, the unity of head and hand in science seems to be dependent upon their relative political unity in society. Do aristocratic intellectuals look down on the artisans and refuse to engage with them, or do they embrace practice? The unity of head and hand in modern science is due to the emphasis which capitalism puts on labor, and how it brings head and hand together in production. As you can see, every time that practice and thought are brought together, it produces a huge intellectual revolution. The Axial Age, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. And when thought becomes too abstract, it always marks the beginning of the end. Philosophical positions like mind-body dualism can therefore be understood as reflecting the mind-body dualism of society. Perhaps of most interest is the idea that the Greek philosophers were not only dependent upon the slaves for their material existence, but also for their intellectual existence. They physically lived off of them, but they also intellectually leached off of their practices for their rich labor analogies. This idea amounts to saying that philosophers are incapable of having a new thought if they have not been exposed to a new technique. Do the great ideas in history even really belong to the great thinkers? Or do they instead belong to the great forgotten inventors of techniques, which the thinkers merely reflected in thought? Is this a case in which one class has robbed another class of their collective legacy? Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. Please like and subscribe as well. Thank you very much.